Good morning, genealogists. It's Craig. And I don't think I've even had my first cup of coffee yet. But that noon deadline is looming. So, what shall I talk about today? Well, the other day I was talking about the progression of books that were created by Robert Charles Anderson, fellow American Society of Genealogists, the tools he used to create the books I'm about to talk about in his book, Elements of Genealogical Analysis. So I got to thinking, well, maybe I should share the projects that he dealt with, but I want to step back for just a moment and talk about the books that deal with families before his books. And those are the silver books, Mayflower families through 5 generations. They've dealt in the silver book realm with more than 25 passengers. In other words, there are 25 sets of books that deal with a specific passenger. But remember that some passengers came with their wives, and some passengers not only came with their wives, but also came with children. So I descend from 7.5 or something like that. And you wonder how half, and it's Francis Cook, because I descend from the marriage of his second, because I descend from Francis Cook's wife, but a child from her first marriage, not her second marriage to Francis Cook, so it doesn't count. But I think I have at least 7, maybe I'm up to 8, because I just found another one this year, and I've been working on this a long time, so to find another one this year was kind of phenomenal for me. So there are the silver books, and this one happens to be Volume 16, Part 1, John Alden. I descend from Hopkins, Alden, Edward Fuller, or maybe it's Samuel Fuller. I never can keep those two straight because there's two Fuller passengers on the Mayflower. Who else? Well, that's embarrassing. Anyway, there's 7 of them. Well, maybe it's because of the Mullins, because of John Alden's wife, Sarah, John Howland. And John Howland is an exception to this series in that the descendants of Desire, and maybe some others, were done separately from the Silver Project, and they're now out of print. And the families decided they don't want to have them reprinted, is my understanding. That's really a shame. But I'm trying to remember the author. I think it was White. Maybe wrong there. Fortunately, I was able to snag a copy. I used to sell it, and I had taken a copy home to deal with, and I hadn't brought it back. And then it went out of print, so I was able to keep my own copy. These silver books go in and out of print. For example, Edward Fuller Volume 4 is currently out of print. But there also are some pink books and green books that deal with Soul and Delano. And I know that Soul is being converted into a silver book eventually. So this is where, if there's the thought that you have a Mayflower ancestor, you have to know who the Mayflower people are. You have to know how you connect to that Mayflower ancestor before you can actually get into these books. But they're in most genealogical libraries in the North anyway. Although I do have a story about the Howland family a couple of generations later. Desire Gorham, the Gorham family, and I think it's James Gorham, it may be John, but I think it's James, moves to Washington, North Carolina from Barnstable, Massachusetts. And in his mother's will it says, don't forget my son in North Carolina, I give him my property, kind of thing. And then when he dies in North Carolina, he says, don't forget I've got property up in Barnstable that I got from my mother. Those are things that make genealogy easy. So Alden, Mullins, Howland, Tilley, Hopkins, that's 5, right? Well, there's Constance Hopkins and Stephen Hopkins. Constance is a daughter of Stephen, so that's 6. And then the Fuller makes 7. I think there's another one, but who can remember? There's so many of them. Anyway, the silver books are the beginning of knowledge about people who were in New England from the very beginning. The follow-on to that is a 3-volume set known as The Great Migration Begins. And it covers from the period 1620 to 1633. And these are, basically by name, and there are vignettes associated with each one. The vignettes can go on for several pages. I descend from a Samuel Bass, who married Ruth Alden, who was the daughter of John Alden. So Samuel Bass arrived about that time, or not about that time, arrived in that time. So what we have, in addition to the names of all the children, and basically these only go for 2 generations. They have the immigrant and they have the children, and then knowledge about the immigrant. Whereas in the silver books are, again, like the title says, through 5 generations. So with The Great Migration Begins, you'll see, for example, we know the origin of Samuel Bass in Essex, England. We know his migration in 1633. His first resident is Roxbury, and he removes to Braintree in 1640. He's a yeoman. He was a deacon for 50 years of the Church of Braintree. He became a freeman in 1634. He signed his will, which meant that he likely knew how to write. And definitely he knew how to write because he was the first Braintree town clerk. And there are several offices that are mentioned. And then it talks about his estate. And then it talks about his birth being about 1600 based on his age of death. His death in Braintree in 1694. His marriage in Essex to Anne Bass, or Anne Savell rather. And then the names of all of the children, of which there were 8, and mine being number 3, John, who also was buried in Saffron Walden in Essex. He's born in 1630, and he married in Braintree in 1657, Ruth Alden, daughter of John Alden, and he married second Hannah Sturtevant, the widow of Samuel Sturtevant. So pretty detailed stuff. I have a friend who's, I know it shocks you that I might have a friend whose maiden name is Howland. So I once went to her and I said, well, we must be cousins. I mean, you must descend from John Howland, right? And she said, no, I don't descend from John Howland. And she saw the look of disappointment in my face because, after all, I thought I had a cousin. But she had a twinkle in her eye, and I said, okay, well, which Howland do you descend from? And she said, I descend from Henry Howland, his brother. And Henry is found in volume 2 of The Great Migration Begins. And it shows his birth in England, his migration in 1632, his residing in Plymouth and then living in Duxbury, and that he's a freeman in 1633, and he too signed his will, and his inventory included books valued at 10 shillings. He was in various offices. They talk about his estate and his birth, his death, his marriage in 1628 to Mary, assuming that she was the mother of his children. Mary Howland, who'd been the wife of Henry, died in Duxbury in 1674. And then it lists the 8 children of Henry. And it also tells you that Henry is the brother of John Howland, which is my ancestor, and then Arthur Howland. And there's some notes and bibliographic information. And included in here, also in this volume, because this begins in 1620, is John Howland also. So if you're missing some of the pieces of John Howland, this might be the place to actually go. Arthur evidently is not in this volume. So the Silver folks, because they're arriving in 1620, are also in The Great Migration Begins, but I rely on the Silver books. But nothing prevents you from dealing with Great Migration Begins. There is a 7-volume set of books after The Great Migration Begins known as The Great Migration. And all of these things are alphabetical. I don't know off the top of my head. I think I descend from John Betts, but I'm not positive yet. So it's one of those things. So in volume 1, there is John Betts, who arrived in 1634 on the Francis. So I think I can get back. I have not worked on him yet, but eventually I think I will get back to John Betts. But that's the Hope Springs Eternal kind of situation of genealogists. So these 3 sets of books are probably the mainstays of New England research prior to 1635. So 1635 and before that. So Anderson has attempted to bring into 2 sets of books all the information known relating to people up to 1635. So again, 3 sets of things, although they look very similar, 2 of them do. So Mayflower families, The Great Migration Begins, covers 1620 to 1633, and then The Great Migration, 1634 and 1635. So my question would be, when are you going to do 1636? But that's just me. So, just a short one today, because I'm trying to catch up and I'm so far behind. And I'm about to make a road trip. So, this has been Craig, Just Genealogy, talking about early books for New England research, especially those in the Plymouth area. Mayflower passengers, supply passengers, the Winthrop Fleet people. Maybe I'll next week talk about a book we have. We actually have 2 books on the Winthrop Fleet, which is where many of these people came from. So again, have a great day. Don't forget to subscribe. We're over 400 now. Thank you all very much for your support. I couldn't do this without your support. Actually, I probably would anyway, but it just gratifies me to have people actually want to listen to the sound of my voice. Have a great day.